we're going to have enough seating room, right? People forget. Remember last summer? Remember the air quality was in Seattle. So this is a good turnout, and I thank you. Anyway, but before we begin, I don't know how many of you know the president of the Greater Hensel Community Center. That's Celia Greta. And she wants to say a few words just before we begin our program. Celia?
Thank you, Annette. Are you sure this thing's working?
Yes.
Okay. I did want to do a quick commercial for next Saturday. We are holding our annual chili cook-off, and it is starting at 6 o'clock here in the West Room of the Hansel Community Center. There are going to be 4 teams participating. There'll be the Puget Sound Anglers, victors from many years' contests, North Kitsap Fire and Rescue, Hansville Helping Hands, and the Hansel Community Center is also going to submit a chili. Now, the important thing to do is remember 2 things. One is bring your own bottle, because, and secondly, vote for your favorite chili with your dollars, because this is a contest, and afterwards some kind good people count up all the money and proclaim the victor. It's all in aid of a good cause, which is the Community Partnership Fund, which buys vouchers for cab rides and bike helmets to elementary school students, all kinds of good stuff. So thank you very much, and we'll get on with it.
The Community Outreach Fund is the fire department's community outreach fund.
Thank you for the clarification. Okay, the Community Outreach Fund is part of NKFNR. Thank you, everyone.
Hello again. So our speaker tonight is Josh Halofsky, who's a research scientist with the Department of Natural Resources. Josh is a Jersey boy who moved to the Pacific Northwest in 2003 when I moved here.
That's why I moved.
We go way back. He received his BA in Environmental Science from Washington University in St. Louis, a Master's in Geography from Rutgers, and a PhD in Landscape Ecology from Oregon State. So as a researcher, he's particularly interested in the differences, he told me, between the fires east and west of the Cascades, and the conditions that promote, the different conditions that promote each, what causes them, how they might change with climate change, and how we can prepare for these events, the future. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight. Please hold your questions until after the presentation, and well, let him begin.
Great.
Thank you.
No, thank you for inviting me out here. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. And while holding questions to the end is great, if there's anything confusing that I'm saying, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, and I'll try and provide an explanation during the talk. Thank you guys all for making the time to come out here on a Tuesday, rainy evening. Turn it up a little more. I don't know how.
Yes, you did.
You can do that?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Better? Yes? Okay. Just to reiterate, I really appreciate you guys all taking the time to be here this evening, so thank you very much. So to begin, I guess if you had asked me a few years ago about fire on the west side, I probably would have given you a funny look, because a few years ago I wasn't really thinking about fire here in western Washington. A couple of years ago, my colleagues and I, we were actually asking what on the surface feels like an entirely different question. And that's, how much old growth was there here on the west side, right? Prior to Euro-American settlement. It feels like one of those really basic questions that we probably should have answered by now. You know, my elementary kids, school kids would probably ask me this very same question. And the truth is, no one up until recently had been able to answer this. And what we naively thought was a simple question ended up being kind of difficult, because what we soon realized is, if you want to know about old growth, well, well, then you got to think about the disturbances that shape the landscape and ultimately limit or constrain how much old growth could have ever been present. And sure, we need to recognize the important role of wind as a really common disturbance along the coast of Washington. But if we step back and think about Western Washington more broadly, the primary disturbance that have shaped these lands historically is actually fire. Now, probably when most of us hear the word fire, our minds immediately gravitate to Eastern Washington. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, just look at this map of 32 years of fire footprints behind me. We can see that by and large, the vast majority of fires and the vast majority of area burned has occurred in the eastern half of the state. That kind of makes sense too, right? We implicitly recognize the climate between eastern and western Washington is different. And one way those differences in climate manifest themselves are differences in the kinds of disturbances and the way those disturbances operate on the landscape. So if we take our dry forests in eastern Washington as an example, historically they experienced really frequent fire, but that fire tended to be of low intensity, meaning it tended to burn the small stuff while leaving the more resistant trees. And this frequent fire tended to create a rather open forest condition in our dry forests, as you can see between time 0 and 80 years when we allowed fires to burn on the landscape. Now, as the story goes, due to now nearly a century of fire suppression, we've fundamentally altered these dry forests in eastern Washington. They're now unnaturally and uncharacteristically dense. Denser forests means there's more biomass, which means there's more fuel, which means now when we get fires in our dry forests, they tend to be more intense and burn more severely than they did in the past. So there are actually a lot of good reasons why we think about fire in the east side, but I'm here tonight, and I think we're all here tonight because we're starting to recognize that just maybe we've been underestimating and underappreciating the role of fire here on the west side. I mean, a lot of people think that fire just doesn't really happen on the west side. It's why papers historically referred to our west side forests as asbestos forests, right? To convey the idea that they didn't think these forests actually burned. But it's not really that our forests don't burn. It's that they tend to burn infrequently and as high severity fire, as you can see in the black colors on the map. And I'm going to paint a broad brush and talk about this most common type of fire here on the west side, recognizing that it doesn't quite apply everywhere. Now, breaking these words apart, infrequent conveys the idea that when we get these fires, the time between these fire events tend to span centuries rather than, say, decades like our dry forests in eastern Washington. High severity conveys the idea that when these infrequent fires occur, you tend to have patches of stand-replacing fire that tend to burn 75 to 100% of the trees. And these patches of stand-replacing fire could be hundreds of acres, thousands of acres, tens of thousands of acres, and possibly even hundreds of thousands of acres in size. Now, obviously, when you step back to any individual fire, you're always going to have a mosaic of fire severities. No fire is ever going to be a complete moonscape. And because we're talking about nature, there's a lot of variability. Not every fire is going to conform to this description, but these large patches of stand-replacing fire are the fundamental characteristic of this infrequent and high severity type of fire, which you can think of as occurring, and I say this in an endearing way, kind of the wet and drippy forests here on the west side. And we think this is how forests and fire operate because, well, people have been studying these forests for decades now, and we have a pretty good idea of how these forests grow and develop, and a lot of evidence suggests that they tend to burn with a significant stand-replacing component every 200 to 600 years. But we don't just have to look at beautiful hand-drawn illustrations. We can also go visit fingerprints of past fires on the landscape. You just need to know where to look and what to look for. All right, the where to look part's kind of obvious. You go to landscapes that haven't been disturbed either by humans or other sorts of natural disturbances. But the what to look for is a little trickier and takes some time to develop, I guess, the glasses to see it, because what you look for are differences in the texture and the color of the trees around you. And I'll show you what I mean really by zooming into this middle photo behind me. So when I look at this landscape, I see two distinct forest ages. I see these darker green, rougher textured trees right by these arrows, which represent true patches of old growth forest. And surrounding those islands of old growth is a veritable ocean of lighter green and smoother textured trees, and they're lighter green and smoother textured because they're all younger trees, and they're all young trees of about the same age because they all originated from a stand replacing fire a little over a century ago, and just due to the vagaries and topography or local fire weather, the fire skipped over these old growth patches. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't just have to look for these landscapes to find fingerprints of past fires. We now have more contemporary examples, right? So these are two photos from the 2017 Eagle Creek fire down in the Columbia Gorge. And we can see those characteristic large patches of stand replacing fire. Again, recognizing that this fire doesn't look like this in its entirety, right? It's still a mosaic of fire severities. And again, recognizing that every fire is going to conform to this pattern. But this is our basic understanding right now of the kind of fire the wet and drippy forests here on the west side tend to experience. So one of the questions, though, is how big could these episodes of fire be, right? This is actually a really hard question to answer because by definition these fires are infrequent, meaning you don't have a lot of examples of these fires on the landscape when the time between these fires can span centuries. By definition, because they burn at high severity, they tend to burn up evidence of older fires. And then lastly, Euro-Americans, all of us, we've modified the landscape so much we've further erased evidence of past fires. So this is actually a really hard question to answer, and that's why it hadn't been answered for so long. But it turns out my colleagues and I realized there were enough threads of evidence that we could weave together to what we think estimate how big these fire episodes could be. And I'll tell you about that in a second, but I just want to take a little detour, talk about floods, right? What's a fire talk without talking about floods, I guess? But really, I want to talk about floods because we're familiar with the terminology of floods. I think we've all probably heard of the 100-year flood or the 100-year event that has a 1 in 100 chance of occurring any year, and it's called the 1 in 100-year event because when it occurs, it tends to flood a certain amount of area. And maybe some of us are also familiar with the even rarer 500-year flood event or 500-year event, which while it doesn't occur as often, sure does flood a lot more area when it occurs. Oh, this is near Kent. You can actually look at these maps online through some websites. Yeah. Turns out, though, that the methods and approach we use to estimate flood events, you can use that same approach to estimate fire event sizes as well. And while there's nothing in the literature to suggest there's a 500-year event, there is evidence of 100-year fire events and even a 200-year fire event. So when we apply the same sort of math that we do to floods to fire events, what we find under a certain set of assumptions is that the big fire events, the rarest ones, this 200-year events, burned about 1.7 million acres. Again, this is all math, right, and has some assumptions. But the 25-year event still burned 27,000 acres. And for context, that's about the size of that Eagle Creek fire that we looked at a few slides before. Now, obviously, any fire, no matter how small it is always going to have significant human, social, cultural, spiritual, and economic consequences, right? I don't care how small the fire is. But realistically, ecologically, the Eagle Creek fires, those 25 and 50-year events, are kind of a drop in the bucket from an ecological and fire perspective, right? They're not really the ones that are shaping the landscape. And so only from an ecological perspective, I tend to think of these events, of the 25 and 50-year events, as the small events, again, only from an ecological perspective. And I tend to think about these 100 and 200-year events as the big fires. So I mentioned this was the results we came up with under one set of assumptions, but the reality is, of course, it's a little more complicated because there's a natural variability to these systems, right? There are times in the past where the climate was warmer and fires were a little more frequent. There's a synchrony to this. There are times when the climate was cooler and fires were less frequent and maybe more or less clustered. So there are all sorts of different sort of knobs you can turn. And my colleagues and I, we try to turn all of those knobs across a 6 million acre landscape in the North and West Cascades, so covering all the forest area in the North and West Cascades. And when we turn all the different knobs, we came up with 9 different fire scenarios, making all of which make different assumptions. And all those assumptions are culled from the ecological literature. And it turns out, across our 9 scenarios, it doesn't really matter what you assume. I always tell people, don't try to memorize these specific numbers because I promise you they're wrong. But I feel really good about the orders of magnitude, meaning the largest fires that occurred in this landscape probably burned hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres. And while this was only done for this landscape here, if you expand this sort of analysis to all of Western Washington, that would mean under all of our 9 scenarios, the largest fire episodes probably burned between 1 million acres and maybe 10 million acres. It's a wide range, but it's probably the right order of magnitude. And if you think I'm comfortable ranting about these large numbers, it took a little while to get there, right? Because this is serious numbers, and I wouldn't want to go on a limb. But after going through the literature, I started to become more comfortable with these estimates because it turns out we're not really the first to say this. We think there was a fire episode around 1700 that burned at least 1 million acres on the peninsula and between 3 and 10 million acres across Western Washington. Some of you may be familiar with the 1902 Yackle complex that tended to burn a lot of southwestern Washington and other parts of west side western Washington and Oregon, but cumulatively and altogether, we think burned up to 1 million acres, if not a little more. And some of you may also have heard of the 1933 Tellement burn in northwest Oregon that burned about 350,000 acres, right? So we actually have lines of evidence that starts to support and are consistent with the estimates that we derive. And then just in the last year, some very smart scientists took this characteristic fire map I showed you earlier, and on top of that, they overlaid information from the early 1900 surveys where folks walked the ground and every so often recorded in their notebook the quality of the timber, because timber was the focus then, the size of the trees, the species, but they also tended to note the presence of fire. It could be recent fire or old fire, they just noted the presence. So what these scientists did is they took all of the notes where the surveyors from 1900 noted fire and overlaid it on top of that characteristic fire map. And what they found was in our wet and drippy forests, those infrequent and stand replacing or high severity type of fire, the largest patch recorded in the 1900 survey was also over 1 million acres. And they recorded 5 patches in our wet and drippy forests that were over 250,000 acres in size. So again, it's all very consistent, right? And as my colleagues and I started to read some news accounts and other accounts of some of these historical fires from the 1900s and up through more recently, we noticed that certain factors materialized or popped up over and over again when people were describing these fires, and I thought it might be interesting to share that with all of you. The first thing that we noticed is that not all, but a lot of the fires tended to occur late in the summer, meaning middle of August through maybe end of September. And that kind of makes sense, right? It's after our forests have had a season of drying out, essentially. And of course, the second factor you need for the fire is the really forehead slapper, obvious one, but I need to mention it because your forest can be bone dry and they'll never burn without an ignition source. And while a lot of us think of lightning as a primary ignition source, it is in other parts of the region, but according to some statistics, from between 1972 and 2012, which is a 40-year period, about 95% of all fires started here on the west side were ignited by all of us, by people. So lightning, at least in this 40-year period and for more contemporary times, has been primarily, or fire has been primarily ignited by all of us. So that's obviously enough to get a fire going, but if you really are thinking about the big fires that really shape the landscape, we think the third crucial ingredient are something called synoptic east wind events, which I hadn't really come across or I wasn't aware of until I started looking into this research. Now, typically our winds, right, move from the ocean over the west side into eastern Washington. But during these synoptic east wind events, those patterns reverse. So imagine it's late in the summer, our forests are dry, and you get the synoptic east wind blowing really hot and dry air from eastern Washington or eastern Oregon or interior Canada, blowing across the West Cascades over the Olympic Mountains towards the ocean, right? Already drying out really dry forests, dropping the relative humidity to incredibly low levels, creating tinderbox-like conditions, and that's when you can get a really big fire in a short amount of time. It's how, by some estimates, the Tellement burn consumed 200,000 acres in a day, and how the Yakhol complex traveled 30 miles in a day and a half. Now, according to historical accounts, both of those fires were ignited by people working in the woods. I think the Tillamook burn, if I have my fires correctly in my mind, was ignited in mid-August during a synoptic east wind. But interestingly, the Yakhol complex, according to news accounts, was a result of a fire ignited in May. But in May, no one worries about fire, right? Because the plants are wet. So the fire was ignited in May, we think, by people working in the woods, and it just kind of smoldered and really didn't do much until the middle of September when we got those east winds, and that's when we think it blew up. And so while we may not be familiar with synoptic east winds, it's a mouthful, out here, we've probably all heard of the Santa Ana winds or the El Diablo winds in California, right? They're the reason that some of the terrible California fires a few years ago were in fact so enormous and difficult to contain. Well, the Santa Ana and El Diablo winds are also synoptic east winds. It's just, they occur so much more frequently in California. There's a more colloquial name for it down there. We just don't have that up here. I think at one point, one of those fires was reported to be burning an acre a second. But think about it. If you're going to burn 200,000 acres in a day, that comes out to 2.5 acres a second. I can't really imagine that, but that's what that's just. So I've started to think about these events on the west side less as fire events and a little bit more like wind events that just so happen to be carrying fire, right? Because wind is such a crucial key ingredient. So maybe by now I've convinced you that these big fires have occurred in the past and they're a natural part of the system. But often when we give this talk, there are folks in the audience that say, yeah, but that couldn't happen today, right? For these reasons behind me, fire suppression, modern infrastructure, fuel management. And I say, yeah, these are all incredibly important and play a really important role in our wildfire management when we're talking about the small to moderate fires. So let's look at all of these, though, through the lens of these wind-driven, infrequent, large fire events. Let's start with fire suppression. We've got fuel tankers and fire retardant. We've got bulldozers and building dozer lines. And most importantly, we have incredibly brave individuals risking their lives to try to contain and suppress fires. And they do an admirable job and an incredibly important and helpful job in doing that. But guess what? I don't care who you are. When a fire is burning an acre or 2.5 acres a second, any manager will tell all those people to just get out of the way, right? Human lives are too great of risk when a fire is behaving this way. There's not much we can do. So I would argue during these wind events, fire suppression isn't really much of a factor. What about modern infrastructure? We've got 6 and 8 lane paved roads. We've got dirt roads and forest roads, and they are, again, incredibly important in containing and stopping the spread of fires when we're talking about those small and moderate events. But my mind immediately gravitates to this photo, which is a photo taken in the Columbia Gorge during the Eagle Creek fire. Now again, that was a fire started in 2017 in Oregon by a human in late August, early September. And it kind of sat there for a little while. The people couldn't go in and suppress it the way they wanted to because there were people behind the fire, so they had to try to rescue the people before they went in and tried to contain the fire the way they wanted to. And between the time of them rescuing the fire and being able to do something, an east wind picked up, and most of the fire burned in a very short amount of time. But what's striking to me about this photo is that even though this fire started in Oregon, what we see is the fire burning both sides of the Columbia River. In essence, wind swept embers from the Oregon side of the fire, carried them across what we think was a mile-wide section of the Columbia River, and ignited forests on the west side. So man, if a mile-wide body of water isn't enough to contain or stop the spread during these wind events, I don't know what any sort of paved road or Walmart parking lot or any other sort of barrier is really going to do. And if you still don't believe me, just last week the LA Times did a really interesting piece on looking at the Paradise Fire, which was the city that burned during those terrible California fires I was alluding to earlier. And for those of you that can't read the text associated with this photo, the text says, "Driven by strong winds, the fire charged toward the town of Paradise, launching embers or firebrands as far as 5 miles ahead of the flames." This is a thermal image showing how, as they call it, a blizzard of embers flew over fuel breaks as if they didn't exist, igniting fires all over town. Right? Again, this is California. It's a different environment, but it still shows you the power. It's another example of the power of these east wind events. Let's talk about fuels management. It's something I hear a lot about in DNR because we launched this 20-year forest health strategy for Eastern Washington. So I hear about fuel management a lot. And our 20-year forest health strategy and fuel management in general tends to focus on those dry forests in Eastern Washington. That makes a lot of sense, right? We are in some ways obligated to try to reduce the density and amount of trees in these forests to return them to their more natural condition of the past, to try to place that low-intensity fire back in the landscape, minimize or reduce the amount of stand replacing fire, and make these dry forests more resilient to fire in a changing climate. So fuels management gets thumbs up by me when we're talking about those forests in Eastern Washington. But I'm here tonight not to talk about Eastern Washington, but to talk about the west side, which has some of the most productive forests in the world. These are forests that are naturally dense. Fire suppression doesn't really make these forests more dense. These are forests that naturally burn as a high severity or stand replacing fire. Fire suppression doesn't result in these forests burning really more severely than they would naturally. It's just how these systems operate. Now, even if you wanted to treat a large landscape to reduce the risk of fire, how could you ever be successful doing that across a large landscape? Because, again, these are some of the most productive forests in the world. It would be a Sisyphean task. You'd have to go in and repeatedly treat these landscapes over and over again. I don't know how you could ever keep up. And even if somehow we were successful in doing that, now, even if you wanted to treat a large landscape to reduce the risk of fires, how could you ever be successful doing that across a large landscape? Because, again, these are some of the most productive forests in the world. It would be a Sisyphean task. You'd have to go in and repeatedly treat these landscapes over and over again. I don't know how you could ever keep up. And even if somehow we were successful in doing that, well, congratulations, we'll have just created a forest with no historical analog in our wet and drippy forests here on the west side, right? And even if we wanted to do that, I don't know how popular it would be to create those sorts of conditions and kind of remove the myriad of values we associate with these older forests from a habitat, cultural, spiritual perspective, right? I don't think society would really go for it, even if you wanted. If you put it another way, if you look at a snapshot of forest growth and development, I don't see a time across these forests growing and developing where fuels aren't present enough to carry fire. It's just not a fuel-limited system, right? And so when I talk about Western Washington more broadly, I would argue that forest management is less relevant here. It still has a role to play, and especially in other parts of Western Washington, it has an important role to play, like maybe in the rain shadow of the Olympic Peninsula. But by and large, it's not as significant of a role as it is in Eastern Washington. So we're all feeling really happy and cheerful and good right about now, so it'd be a great time to bring up climate change, right? And don't worry, I'll come back to that, I'll get there, but before I do, I just want to wrap up some other thoughts when we think about fire and our forests here on the west side, at least in the past. And I want to start off by reminding all of you that a lot of the old growth that we have on the landscape today is really birthed from fires in the past, right? These are forests that are adapted to stand replacing fire. It's a natural sort of disturbance to have in these systems. Adapted to stand replacing fire. It's a natural sort of disturbance to have in these systems. And sure, our forests may not be very resistant to fire, meaning when you get a fire, it tends to burn everything up. But they've sure been resilient to fire up till now, meaning you may burn up, but given enough time, those forests would grow and develop, by and large, back into the old growth that's on the landscape today. So we've started to think about these infrequent fires a little bit like we do earthquakes. We know the big one, the Cascadia earthquake, full rip 9.0. It's going to occur. It's inevitable, right? But we don't know when it's going to occur. It could be tomorrow, a year from now, a century or more from now. We don't know when it's going to occur, but we know it will at some point, and it's going to have a profound impact on society for years, if not decades afterwards. But I'm hoping, and I think most of us don't necessarily panic by this idea, right? We acknowledge and accept the risk of living here in the beautiful western part of our state. We plan and prepare as much as we want, and then we move on with life and our days. Well, maybe we could think about these big fires in a similar way. Just like an earthquake, we know the big fire is inevitable, and it would be inevitable regardless of our changing climate, because it's how our forests operated in the past. And just like an earthquake, we don't know when it's going to occur, but it will have a profound impact on society for years, if not decades, once it happens. But I would hope and propose we don't panic by this idea. We acknowledge and accept the risk. We plan and prepare, and we move on, like an earthquake, or a volcano, or a tsunami. I mean, we do this subconsciously already. Maybe we just need to add this to the list of these sorts of disasters and events that are going to happen that we need to plan for. So let's talk climate change for a little bit. I'm not going to go into a lot of detailed projections with you. I'm happy to answer any questions you have to the best of my ability afterwards, but I'd like to just think about climate change more broadly with respect to these 3 factors that I noted to all of you earlier. Projections pretty consistently indicate that our future is going to be warmer, and our summer is much warmer than currently. Most projections indicate our summers are going to be drier in the future, and many of the projections also indicate the duration or length of our warm and dry period will also increase. So warmer, drier future, maybe a lengthening of that warm and dry period, well, that all to me indicates the risk of fire to that one factor is only going to increase. As far as ignition sources, I can talk about lightning with you afterwards if it's of interest. From my perspective, the science is still uncertain whether lightning is going to increase or decrease, and as well as would it increase during the summer or during the winter when we wouldn't have to worry about it. So I'd say the science is a little still uncertain or not settled when it comes to lightning. But while it's not related to climate change, we do have projections that indicate another 2.5 million people will be moving to our beautiful state in the next couple of decades. Assuming what, conservatively, 1 million of those people settle on the west side, well, that means 1 million more possible ignition sources. Again, which would only, right, increase the risk of fire. So, do you want to say that louder?
I said, this is where we need the wall.
So we can say for climate change, without knowing anything else, that the likelihood of fire on the west side is going to increase, right? The amount of area burned will probably increase in the future. That doesn't necessarily know or tell us, though, what the likelihood in the future holds for these larger events, right? We can talk about the overall risk. But remember, the key ingredient for those large fires are these synoptic east winds, and I'm here to tell you and disappoint you by saying we just don't know yet. And we don't know because no one until recently had thought to ask the question, but come find me in a year or two and hopefully we will have a better answer to this question. But without knowing whether these synoptic east winds will be increase or decrease, and it's not just that variable, you also need to know if they'll become more or less intense, right? Maybe become more infrequent but less intense, and so maybe that's not a big deal, or maybe they become less frequent and less intense. Without knowing what's going to happen with these synoptic east winds, we can't say anything definitive about the likelihood of these larger events in the future. Again, all we can say with quite a bit of confidence is there's probably going to be more fire in our future, broadly, at least those small or moderate events. Now, because Annette put it in the advertisement, I have to give a little nod to smoke, which is not my area of expertise, but we can just kind of go along with more fire equals more smoke. And based on the smoke we've had the last 2 years, which wasn't from West Side, it was from Eastern Washington or Canada or Oregon or California. We know regionally fire and area burn is going to increase across that region, which means that when we think about more smoke in the future, we have to think where those sources are more broadly than just our state. So again, another indicator that smoke is probably going to just become a normal part of life, which it actually was in the past. It almost feels like the last couple of decades have been an anomaly with the lack of smoke in some ways to me. So what do we do? This part is very forest management centric because that's all I've really had time to think about. So it totally ignores a lot of other important aspects like human health, like emergency response, right? There's a whole list of things that I am totally ignoring here, and I'm sorry, those other areas just haven't been thought of as deeply yet. So this is really more of a forest management centric list. And we won't go into too much detail, but I kind of broke it up into things you could do before a fire, during, and after a fire. And without even looking at the list of things you can consider doing before a fire, guess what? The silver lining, perhaps, is that it doesn't matter whether you're planning for a small to moderate fire or a large fire. You can pretty much do the same thing, and it would have either a positive impact, and there are a couple of instances where we're just not sure if it would make a difference for those large events. But the good news is, whether you're planning for a small to large fire, you can plan in a similar way. And I'm not going to really go through all of these. I can always send out a sheet later with all of these on them. But there are things we can do, like protecting valuable infrastructure and resources using fire-wise principles, which is a practice of clearing trees around homes. There's a whole list of things you can do. There's people, extension agents at Washington State University and internally with DNR that can help you with this if it's something that's of interest to any of you. There's some basic conservation biology principles, limiting human emissions, but the one that's probably most important from a forest management perspective right now is planning and thinking about what you're going to do after the big event. Because we're all human. We all know if we don't plan for it, what are we going to do? We're going to do exactly what we did in the past. Right? We plant with the same species at the same densities, same locations, and maybe that's okay, but maybe it's not, and we should at least be deliberative about it now while we still have the time. During a fire, there aren't really many things you can do. You really have two options. You can either suppress it and contain it, or let it go and burn. And it kind of depends what values you are trying to protect or maintain. You could suppress a fire if you're more interested in maintaining a pattern or structures like old-growth forest. But, the basic tenet of restoration ecology is to allow natural processes like fire to occur on the landscape to try to maintain all the processes and connections across an ecosystem. So I'm not here to pass a value judgment. They both have equal value to me. But of course, there's going to be greater risk by permitting fire to occur. That's all I'm saying here. What you do after a fire, again, from a forest management perspective, it's a lot of basic conservation biology principles of promoting diversity of trees, either within or across stands. And of course, I wouldn't be a card-carrying scientist if I didn't promote using these fires as learning opportunities for research and monitoring and adaptive management. And in all honesty, I have another 70 slides I can go through right with me to talk more about fire, about old growth, and about climate change, but I don't want to bore all of you. I just want to give you an idea of some of the things we can think about, and mostly, I just want to thank you all again for your time, and I look forward to your questions and any conversations we can have now, so thanks.
In California, a big human source of fire was faulty electrical equipment or problems with electrical equipment.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true in this part of the world as well?
I mean, a lot of our power lines are above ground in this part of the world too. I can't speak to how regularly the vegetation is cleared around them. I know that's part of their objectives for the energy companies. I can't speak to anything beyond that. So it could, in theory, be an issue. Whether it actually is, I don't know.
I mean, historically, hitting sources of fires.
Oh, historically? I'm not familiar or aware of electric fires of that nature ever igniting any of our fires here on the west side. Yeah.
Escape-controlled burns, leave the pack.
Escape-controlled burns, leave the pack for...
Fire costs.
Oh, for fire costs.
For cause.
Oh, for cause?
Somebody that has a controlled debris.
Oh, right, like
Campfire.
burning their debris, yeah, cigarette butts, tailpipes, even sparks from tailpipes.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of...
Catalytic converters on
Yeah.
playgrounds.
Yep, you park your hot car, and even that's been known to ignite fires in some locations, more on the east side, but yeah, there's a plethora of human-related causes.
companies have monocultures of mostly Doug fir and things like that. Is there any impetus to encourage them to promote diversity in these enormous tracts of land where they have trees?
I think that's a multi-part answer. So part of it depends on the management objective, right? So a lot of our private industrial lands, their management objective primarily is revenue to their stockholders, to the company. And it's probably in their interest, because they're on such short rotations and because of the economics of it, to keep those plantations as homogeneous as possible. It makes sense from an economic perspective. Now, from a climate adaptation perspective, those are some of the forests that actually have the most frequent opportunities to eventually change their management, right? Because those forests are managed on 35 to 45-year rotations, maybe on average. So they have more opportunities to change what they do in any stand than, say, the Forest Service, right, which don't really manage much and maybe thin more in some instances to promote and accelerate successional development, or late successional development. So in that sense, it's more an advantage. The economics of mixed species stands from a plantation perspective, it obviously makes it harder when you're trying to, at certain times, try to extract the wood from one species versus another. It costs a lot more. So one idea is to maybe keep stands homogeneous but diversify across stands. I think I'm answering part of your question or aspects of it, but I don't know if I've satisfactorily answered your question, so if I haven't, can you ask it again? Or did I?
No, that's really interesting. What if there were, say, 20-acre parcels next to one another, cedar, fir, whatever, would that decrease the likelihood of big fires?
Not necessarily for these wind-driven fires, but obviously promoting diversity can have an impact depending on what you're planting on those smaller fires. And then you also, by planting different species, they all have different regeneration strategies. So post-fire, it can give you more of a free lunch in terms of what comes back naturally on its own. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So the DNR has no control over what a large lumber company might, if they're all doing Douglas fir, you can't tell them, well, why don't you surround it by alder and birch, that might stop. You can't say that.
No, so a couple of things. It's really interesting you brought up alder because it is a natural fuel
Yes,
break,
that's what I
fire
mean.
break. Yeah, again, often for those small to moderate fires. Alder can't be planted everywhere though. It has certain site conditions, right? It has to be more of a riparian or wetter site. So we couldn't do that, and I know from your perspective, DNR is just one agency. But a lot of the stuff, or everything that influences the private timber companies and the small forest landowners, is from a forest practices side of DNR, and I don't interact with anyone from that side. Everything I do is more related to lands that DNR manages for the state and for counties and schools. So I'll do my best to answer these more forest practice related questions, but it's really outside of my sphere of knowledge generally. So just keep that in mind. Yeah.
So wouldn't it make sense for your sphere to communicate with the forest practices part of this in terms of climate change and the hotter, drier, longer conditions, all of the increase in use of desiccant materials like pesticides or spray onto the clear cuts twice after a clear cut happens. I mean, it seems like a climate change policy that's comprehensive should be an urgent order of business.
So DNR is in the middle of a climate change effort. First of all, on the lands it manages, right, for the schools and counties that I was referencing before. And, you know, we have aquatics, we have habitat, we have a ton of different values. And so we're going through a process right now. We have one or two climate advisors and policy advisors working internally with individuals within DNR, as well as with an external group of university scientists to help develop a climate policy for DNR. Part of that will also look at forest practices, but forest practices may be aware of the science. They're smart people. But I don't think I don't think just being aware of the policy, they have to be very careful in what the decisions they make and how things are implemented because of all the different landowners that would be affected. I'm not a forest practices person. They'd probably give you a much better answer in defense of what they do or don't do. I can't really do that, but sure they're aware of the climate science as well, and they're part of this process that I just described.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about our experience of the last year.
Sure.
With DNR and the Forest Practices Division. So they have been helping private industry get around the actual regulations in order for industry to do what it wants to do. So what I'm talking about are things like coaching poke timber, for example, in how to avoid SEPA reviews. And we have emails between industry and DNR showing them how to subvert that process. And it's very concerning because, like you say, there are many aspects to this. There's the streams and the salmon and the orcas and the marble muralets and so forth. Not to mention the soil, right? And a lot of us in the community feel like we don't have people at DNR on the forest practices side who are really working for the best interest of the environment, the habitat, and the communities. And we understand that human activities contribute, right, to the situation that we're in. I worked the Eagle Creek fire. I'm a nurse and I do a lot of disaster work. I mean, I've been to everything. Earthquakes, floods, fires, OSO, all over the world. The Eagle Creek fire was the one time that I have really been afraid. When we saw the flaming pine cones dropping down around the Red Cross shelter, where there were 250 people and not enough vehicles to get them out. It's a very different kind of situation. And I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. Out here, all you have to do is walk in the woods, and it's crunchy. It's been crunchy. It's getting crunchier over the last several years. And when we had that lightning storm, that really freaky lightning storm about a week or so ago, I know it was on a lot of people's minds,
Yeah.
but the fuel is here,
Mhm.
and we have an ignition source. But there doesn't seem to be the same priority for reducing the risk as much as we can and educating and preparing communities for how to respond. We all know what to have in our earthquake kits, right?
Right?
We know who to call.
Yep.
We know what to do. But for the fire situation, I think we're lagging behind in that. And is that something that your department can promote?
So, well, no, it's a great question, and we presented a presentation similar to this one to the commissioner a little less than a year ago, right? Because this is all really new science. While we recognize that there's a risk of fire on the west side, and that risk may increase, just the magnitude of the effect was unknown. We are looking at the west side and thinking about strategies for the west side. But again, because it's so new and so much attention has been paid rightly in a lot of ways to the east side, we're still developing those strategies and ideas, not even internally with DNR, but within the broader scientific community. I gave this talk at the Tellement tribe. They had a West Side Fire meeting in November, and there were emergency responders there, and this was the first time they were hearing this information, and it opened up their eyes, and it made them realize that they need to start thinking about how they would respond and plan for this too. So it's not just a DNR forest thing, it's looking at a lot of our agencies and coming up with ideas of how different aspects that impact society would respond. Right? With the Synoptic East Winds research, one of the outcomes we hope to get is to be able to identify the conditions that tend to promote, these east winds, right? When the atmospheric pressures in certain locations, right? And with the idea being that maybe eventually, if we do find some sort of association between these broader climate signals and east winds broadly, we can come up with an early warning system, right? So to have people be more prepared for that potential. So there are different aspects, but this is all really new. I know King County is thinking about this and trying to organize ideas and thoughts about this, but it's earthquake preparedness. We've had a big push over a decade probably of pushing and preparing. This is in its infancy. Yeah.
Couldn't climate change increase the likelihood of a lot more beetle damage like we've seen with the drought conditions recently?
Right, so the question was, couldn't climate change increase the amount of beetle damage? Kind of depends on the beetle and the insect, right? So mountain pine beetles are expected and mountain pine beetle outbreaks on the west side are expected or thought that they may become more common, in part because with warmer temperatures they can complete an additional life cycle in a year. But the projections also indicate that they're going to move higher up in elevation because the conditions will be more suitable. Beyond mountain pine beetle, the science on insects and diseases is very uncertain. There was a synthesis that came out just a year ago looking at different sorts of pathogens, insects and diseases, and for many of them, it was uncertain still, just because we don't know enough about them. But there's also an interesting stress complex of multiple stressors when you interact, beetle damage with fire potential, and that's also being examined as well.
This might be a silly question.
It won't be.
Something that's bothered me
Okay.
for probably decade now, and that's that my evergreen trees, cedar and fir will, are now not a block. They are lacy, and their limbs are stretching out further, ridiculously far. Do you have?
I have to be a tree doctor too.
Yes, well, you should have brought in an army with you. What do you think would be the cause of that? Is that lack of?
You know, we have a pathologist and entomologist, arm of DNR. There's some great people. I can give you the names afterwards, and they often go to small landowners and visit properties to assess and try to diagnose what's causing the problem. Sometimes they could do it over the phone with more information or with photos. But I could give you that information. I couldn't tell you that just based on what you told me.
And it's not just my property, it's all throughout the county. And a lot of the evergreens that are following the roadways are dying.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of reports of hemlock, western hemlock, as well as some cedars and big leaf maple that are starting to feel and look more stressed in some locations. A lot of people think it's climate related because well, it's been wet this year, and maybe we haven't technically had droughts every year for many, many years. It's been unusually dry for an extended period, so that over time would stress the trees. So it could be from an extended dry period as well. The trees that would manifest that are ones that are less drought tolerant, right? Like the hemlock and maybe the cedar and big leaf maple. It's not happening everywhere though, right? If you go back and look at the pollen record for the last millennia or several millennia, right, where people take sediment cores from lakes, just like you take ice cores, you dig it up and you look at the rings and the different strata in the core to look at the pollen grains that were present, you can see that we often had the same species as we do now in the past. It's just the relative abundance of those species changed as our climate was historically warmer or cooler. So, you know, even in the future, that weren't painted black, right? They had more of a mixed severity type of fire in the past. And those are the locations where I've been talking about treating mostly through thinning, not necessarily chemical spraying. Again, I guess it depends on your management objective and intent. But
Kind of. I know that a lot of us are pretty concerned with the broadcasting aerial spraying of glyphosate that's been going on in the Olympic Peninsula, which probably has a lot to do with her sick trees and probably has a lot to do with the dying and stressed trees along the roadsides as well, because they use that glyphosate along all the highways. And what is the DNR role in limiting or restricting the use of glyphosate, and even on private property, whether it's Pope Industries property or some other industrial lumber grower?
I have no idea. Again, that's all the forest practices, the regulatory arm. I have no idea what role DNR has in that. I'm sorry, it's just, again, I can think of one person in forest practices I really interacted with in the last several years. It's just not something I do. I'm sorry. If you need forest practice contacts, I can try and dig some up and email those contacts to Annette if that would be helpful to you.
Well, we have those contacts, but they're not responsive.
Okay.
So here's a question. Can you make recommendations based on your scientific expertise to the regulatory side, saying, this is reality, these are things that can contribute to increased flammability?
I suppose I could inform them. I don't know how often I make recommendations, but what sort of things would I recommend in theory that would increase the flammability? What are you thinking of?
Well, I mean, obviously things like chemical desiccants add to flammability of forest. Clear cutting, right. So maybe the practices that you've seen that are more sustainable, like selective thinning, rotation, diversification, those sorts of things that keep forests healthy and less fire susceptible.
So again, you have to remember though, these forests are almost always susceptible to a fire because they're so productive, right? But
Probably doesn't help to add chemicals, though.
as far as
But the use of
proposed,
chemicals, right, has been very short in terms of the span of forest existence.
yeah, but I don't know much about this. I mean, in theory, those chemicals reduce the amount of biomass, right, in theory. And so that would, in theory, reduce the flammability if you just spray them. But this is really beyond my expertise and knowledge, and I'm not feeling like I can give you a satisfying answer.
This is an important topic.
This is beyond my area of expertise. I'm the fire guy. I'm not the forest practices, regulatory, herbicide
Aren't you saying
spraying.
there's gonna be big fires and there's nothing we can do about it?
Saying that big fire is inevitable. It's gonna happen.
No matter what we do.
No matter what.
Yeah.
It's gonna happen. We're gonna have small and big fires just like we've had in the past. So I'm sure someone's scoring points with someone and I don't know who or what. Yeah.
You're a scientist, right? That's your role with the DNR?
Yes.
Could I just ask you to do all of us a favor? Because I read scientific reports like all the time.
Cool.
So just maybe go over to pubmed.gov or some other academia or research and just please look into the effects of glyphosate and their causative factors in association with fires. The fires we had on the peninsula last year were in places that were just sprayed. And I'm just begging you to please look into it. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, everyone.